War. This video is based on key insights from the book War by Bob Woodward. Section 1. This section covers chapters 1 to 4 in the book. As rioters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, President Donald Trump watched on television from his private dining room next to the Oval Office. His supporters climbed the walls of the historic building, shattered windows, and attempted to force the front doors open with a battering ram. Where is the president? Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was calling the White House, asking aides to connect him with Trump. McCarthy's office was being vandalized, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's was being ransacked. President Trump finally got on the phone, and McCarthy said, "You've got to get out and tell these people to stop. We've been run over." But the president seemed not to grasp the gravity of the situation. The FBI later estimated that over 2,000 people entered the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and it took President Trump 187 minutes to post a tweet telling his supporters to go home. 2 months earlier, Donald Trump had lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, but he rejected the loss. Even now, 35 years after our interview, Trump was convinced any loss, even a presidential election loss, could be brushed aside if he simply didn't fold. The House Select Committee investigating the January 6 attack later concluded that Trump engaged in a successful but fraudulent effort to persuade tens of millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him. "You need to call Joe Biden, and you need to do it today," House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy told Trump shortly after the attack. The phone call to Biden never happened, but on his last night in the Oval Office, January 19, 2021, Trump handwrote a 2-page letter to Joe Biden, finished it at 10:00 p.m., signed it Donald J. Trump, and placed it inside the desk. On board Air Force One, Trump took a call from Republican National Committee Chairperson Ronna McDaniel, and Trump said, "I'm done," cutting her off. "I'm starting my own party." The Republican National Committee leadership would later make clear to Trump's advisors that the former president's lust for revenge would hurt not only his legacy but his finances, and Trump backed down. Chekhov's gun was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's immediate thought as he reviewed overhead satellite photos that showed an unprecedented 110,000 Russian troops massing on the border of Ukraine. It was April 2021, only the third month of Biden's presidency. The intelligence also showed Russian naval forces were actively deploying to the Black Sea, a vast inland body of water bordered by Ukraine and Russia. Was Putin hanging his pistol on the wall? "I'm not looking for a reset," Biden said during his first weeks as president. "I'm not looking for some kind of good relationship, but I want to find a stable and predictable way forward with Putin." In an ABC television interview on March 16, Biden was asked if he thought Putin was a killer, and Biden said, "I do." Sullivan suggested Biden meet with Putin in person, and Biden agreed instantly. "I know people are going to criticize me and say if you meet with Putin, you're elevating him, you're legitimizing him," he said. "If we make the offer to meet for June, it gives Putin some incentive to say, hey, what have the Americans got? You know." That might lead Putin to reduce pressure on Ukraine's border and deter the likelihood of a potential military operation in the spring. Dr. Colin Kahl, an academic and defense secretary, Lloyd Austin's undersecretary for defense policy at the Pentagon, remembered Biden working the Ukraine account for the Obama administration with relish and visiting Kyiv, the capital, 4 times during his vice presidency. Now on April 13, 2021, as president, Biden phoned President Putin and warned Putin not to start a new military incursion into Ukraine. Biden switched gears and said, "Let's meet. Let's you and I sit down. You bring your concerns, and I will bring mine," Biden said. "On any and all topics. And we'll sit face to face, and we'll talk about all of it." For Biden, it was standard for an American president to meet with a Russian leader as his predecessors had. "Okay," Putin finally replied, "I would like to have the summit also. Let's have our teams work on it." Dr. Fiona Hill, a former intelligence analyst specializing in Russian affairs for Presidents Bush and Obama, believed Trump idolized Putin and that made him extremely vulnerable to manipulation. President Biden called her out of the blue and gathered a group of Russia experts, including Hill, in the Roosevelt Room of the White House to talk about Putin and get a feel for the Russians' thinking. Section 2. This section covers chapters 5 to 9 in the book. Retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, a loyal Trump advisor, noted that when the Trump administration left office on January 20, 2021, Ukraine was not considered a primary concern. Issues like Iran, North Korea, and China, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, took precedence. Kellogg believed that Putin was preoccupied with the coronavirus, even to the point where President Trump secretly sent Putin COVID test machines, and Putin requested that Trump keep the gift a secret. According to Kellogg, Trump's national security advisors saw no indications that Russia was preparing for aggression in Ukraine. In June 2021, President Biden met with President Putin in Geneva. Cybersecurity was high on Biden's agenda, particularly after Russian cyberattacks on Colonial Pipeline and JBS. During the meeting, Putin questioned Biden about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a move initially promised by Trump. Interestingly, Ukraine was barely mentioned during their conversation. Following the meeting, Putin gave a press conference where he deflected questions about threatening Ukraine by framing Russia's military buildup as regular exercises. He also used a charm offensive when speaking about Biden, praising Biden's moral values. Blinken and Endprice observed that Putin's tone was smoother than expected, suggesting a potential interest in a stable relationship. Biden, in his press conference, affirmed the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. He believed Putin was concerned about being encircled, but didn't think it was the driving force in his relationship with the United States. Trump, however, criticized Biden's summit as a win for Russia, while within the White House, there was a sense that they had avoided a potential issue with Russia over Ukraine. In July 2021, Putin published a 5,000-word essay, arguing that Ukraine had never been an independent country. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan viewed this as a declaration of Putin's true beliefs and intentions. Putin stated that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, and that modern Ukraine was a product of the Soviet era, formed on lands historically belonging to Russia. Sullivan's initial thought upon reading Putin's manifesto was the impact of COVID, with U.S. intelligence suggesting that Putin's isolation during the pandemic had altered him. He surrounded himself with like-minded individuals, reinforcing his nationalistic views. Sullivan noted Putin's deep dive into Russian history during his isolation, which seemed to fuel his desire to reclaim Ukraine. But Sullivan and his deputy did not see the manifesto as an immediate declaration of war. Eric Green, National Security Council Russia director, found it unusual for a sitting Russian president to go into such depth and questioned whether Putin's essay would inform Russia's actions. Bill Burns, CIA director, felt the manifesto echoed many past conversations with Putin, highlighting Putin's focus on power and Russia's perceived entitlements. Colin Kahl, Undersecretary for Defense, believed Putin genuinely thought Ukraine was not a real country and that Ukrainians were just Russians, seeing the essay as a display of Putin's imperial ambition to reconstitute a Russian empire, including Ukraine. Meanwhile, Biden was focused on withdrawing American troops from Afghanistan. He viewed the U.S. presence in Afghanistan as mission creep. The initial goal of destroying al-Qaeda had expanded into nation-building. Biden had long opposed further troop increases, recalling his arguments to President Obama a decade earlier against military advice. Despite this, Biden faced the reality of a deal Trump had made with the Taliban to withdraw troops by May 2021. Biden directed Sullivan to conduct a review of the withdrawal options, promising an open mind, but ultimately deciding to proceed with the withdrawal. On April 14, Biden addressed the nation, stating his decision to end the forever war. He visited Arlington National Cemetery, reflecting on the loss of American lives, and was met with immediate criticism. retired General David Petraeus predicted a brutal civil war, and former President George W. Bush expressed concerns about the suffering of Afghan women and girls. Blinken observed that Biden was stung by the criticism. However, Trump gloated about the withdrawal, claiming it was due to his deal with the Taliban and that Biden was merely following through. The withdrawal from Afghanistan descended into chaos. U.S. forces secretly withdrew from Bagram Air Base, leaving the American embassy in Kabul vulnerable. Biden spoke to Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, urging him to change the perception that the fight against the Taliban was going poorly. Ghani reported facing a full-scale invasion supported by Pakistan and international terrorists. The Taliban's surge through the country was rapid, and Afghan forces offered minimal resistance. Kabul fell swiftly, and Ghani fled the country, resulting in the Taliban taking control of the presidential palace. Thousands of civilians swarmed Kabul International Airport in desperate attempts to leave. In response, Trump called for Biden's resignation and criticized his handling of the withdrawal. Biden blamed the Afghan government and military for the situation, stating that the withdrawal was the right decision. A suicide bombing at Abbey Gate resulted in the death of more than 170 people, including 13 American service members. A U.S. drone strike mistakenly killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. On August 31, 2021, Biden announced the end of the war. However, the speech was met with criticism and did not disguise the failure of the withdrawal. Biden shifted blame onto Trump and defended his decision, emphasizing the need to protect America against future threats rather than the threats of 2001. Critics called for the resignation of National Security Advisor Sullivan, who was deeply affected by the events. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley and Vice Admiral Frank Whitworth analyzed the implications of the withdrawal, acknowledging they had underestimated the speed of the collapse. Whitworth lamented that no one anticipated Kabul falling so quickly, attributing it to corruption and the power of social media. The underlying issue was the impulsive decision to deploy U.S. troops without considering the lessons of the past. Section 3. This section covers chapters 10 to 14 in the book. In Maidan Square, Kyiv, in August 2021, British Navy Admiral Tim Woods watched Ukrainian jets fly overhead with his daughter. This display of military power, including new tanks, missiles, and drones, was meant to send a message to Putin, according to Bob Woodward's notes. President Zelensky, with tears in his eyes, promised an independent future for Ukraine and closer ties with NATO, which Woods believed Putin saw as a threat. Woods, part of the UK's military training mission in Ukraine, helped modernize Ukraine's military and combat corruption. He and his family were familiar with Russian intelligence tactics, such as psychological games in their Kyiv apartment. Woods had also observed the buildup of Russian military equipment near the border, noting that even after troop withdrawals, the equipment remained. Weeks after the Afghanistan withdrawal, Admiral Frank Whitworth informed General Milley of intelligence, suggesting a large-scale Russian attack on Ukraine. This warning was multifaceted, leaving Milley and Whitworth thunderstruck. The intelligence indicated a potential conquest by a nuclear nation, an alarming prospect. President Biden received daily intelligence briefings on Russian military activities and intentions. The situation evoked a sense of déjà vu, recalling the 2014 annexation of Crimea, which Biden, then Vice President, and Blinken, then Deputy National Security Advisor, had failed to adequately counter. Blinken was initially hesitant to believe the seriousness of Russia's plans, but Biden was determined not to be caught off guard again. Biden prioritized avoiding direct conflict with Russia, adopting a two-pronged strategy, preventing a Russian invasion and preparing for it. He emphasized preparing the U.S., Ukraine, and allies, ensuring Ukraine had the means to defend itself. Biden insisted on bilateral cooperation with Ukraine, avoiding NATO involvement to prevent escalating tensions with Putin, who viewed NATO as a direct threat. In late August, Biden authorized an additional $60 million defense package for Ukraine, including Javelin anti-armor missiles, delivered quietly to avoid fueling Putin's propaganda. The Javelins, effective fire-and-forget weapons, could destroy tanks and other battle armor. The administration justified the assistance due to increased Russian military activity along the border. On September 1, 2021, Biden welcomed Ukrainian President Zelensky to the White House. Zelensky, a former actor and comedian, had won the 2019 presidential election in a landslide. Before entering politics, he owned a successful television production company and played the fictional president of Ukraine in a popular TV series. During a July 2019 call, President Zelensky sought to purchase more Javelin anti-tank missiles from the United States. Trump responded, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot." Trump then asked Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. When Bob Woodward interviewed Trump in December 2019, Trump defended the call with Zelensky, calling it a perfect phone call. Trump claimed that Zelensky was surprised by the release of the call transcript. Zelensky later told Time magazine that the release had destroyed his trust in Ukraine's allies, feeling like a pawn caught between great powers. During Zelensky's visit to President Biden at the White House, he urged Biden to support Ukraine's NATO membership, a move Biden was hesitant to pursue in the short term. CIA Director Bill Burns had long cautioned against pushing Ukraine towards NATO, warning that it was a brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. In October 2021, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines and CIA Director Bill Burns presented President Biden with top-secret U.S. intelligence, gathered from human sources inside the Kremlin, revealing that President Putin had developed a war plan to invade Ukraine with 175,000 troops. The plan detailed how Russia intended to conquer cities and divide responsibilities to maintain control, alarming Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Russia's war plan involved taking control of Ukraine, eliminating President Zelensky, and controlling the capital, Kyiv. Despite the compelling evidence, the plan seemed illogical, as it would likely harm Russia's economic and diplomatic relations with the United States, Europe, and possibly even China and India. Putin's intentions were not reflected in Russia's public rhetoric, adding to the confusion. Blinken and Biden discussed Putin's conviction that Ukraine needed to be erased from the map and subsumed into Russia. While John Feiner questioned whether Putin comprehended the obstacles, President Biden and his cabinet unanimously agreed that Russia's war plan was dead serious. Despite the uncertainty, Putin's plan sounded irrational for the Russian people, as Haines suggested that Putin was prioritizing his vision over the well-being of Russia. Haines suggested that Putin assumed the world would welcome Ukraine. Biden directed them to look at the situation from all angles. Despite the uncertainty, they wanted to be well prepared. They did not want to compound the situation with what happened in Afghanistan. Blinken began building an international coalition to support Ukraine. However, Blinken updated that most of the allies thought that the invasion was unlikely. Many outright denied it. On October 30 and 31, President Biden chaired a private meeting on the sidelines of the G20 in Rome with leaders including Prime Minister Boris Johnson, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, discussing the Russia plan. Biden described to the world leaders on what Russia's plan was, including that the gun was cocked. President Macron and the German leaders voiced skepticism. They did not think Putin was that crazy. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, found the intelligence credible. Later, Johnson confronted Putin and stated that there was no reason to invade Ukraine. Putin pressed Johnson on when Ukraine will join NATO. The conversation made Johnson realize that Putin's paranoia regarding NATO was a trap. Section 4. This section covers chapters 15 to 19 in the book. In this story, Bob Woodward highlights the escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine, focusing on the diplomatic efforts by the United States to deter a potential invasion. The U.S., under President Biden, uses intelligence to understand and counter Putin's plans. a key decision was made to send Bill Burns, the CIA director, to Moscow to directly confront Putin with the intelligence the U.S. had gathered, and also to deliver a private letter from Biden, emphasizing the consequences of an invasion. Burns's visit to Moscow included meetings with key Russian figures, such as Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Kremlin's Security Council, and a phone conversation with Putin himself. During these interactions, Burns warned of the severe economic and diplomatic repercussions Russia would face if it invaded Ukraine, including potential removal from the SWIFT banking system. Putin, however, remained dismissive of Ukraine's sovereignty and expressed his determination to control the country's choices, while not providing any explicit answer to the consequences that Burns described. Despite the U.S. efforts, there was skepticism among European allies regarding the likelihood of a Russian invasion. Vice President Kamala Harris was sent to Paris to discuss the intelligence with French President Emmanuel Macron and ask for solidarity. While Macron took the threat seriously, other European leaders were not as convinced, leading the U.S. to adopt a strategy of strategic downgrade by declassifying and sharing intelligence publicly to dispel doubt and counter Russian disinformation. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's engagement with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the OSCE meeting in Stockholm further illustrates the tense diplomatic environment. Lavrov denied any intention of invading Ukraine and accused NATO of threatening Russia's security, while Blinken warned of severe costs if Russia took further aggressive action. The story also mentions President Biden's video conference with Putin, in which Biden warned of enormous costs to Russia if it invaded Ukraine. Putin, however, demanded security guarantees to rule out NATO's eastward expansion. Bob Woodward then contrasts Biden's approach with former President Trump's, who had a friendlier relationship with Putin and approved the sale of lethal weapons to Ukraine, a move that Obama had hesitated to take. Section 5. This section covers chapters 20 to 24 in the book. In this story, Bob Woodward focuses on the tense period leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, highlighting key decisions and disagreements within the U.S. government. A central theme is President Biden's firm stance against sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, a decision rooted in the negative experiences of past military interventions like Vietnam and Afghanistan. This position was challenged by some, including Sullivan, who argued for maintaining ambiguity and leveraging the U.S. big stack of chips to potentially deter Putin through strategic bluffing. However, Biden was concerned about the impact of bluffing on U.S. credibility globally. The intelligence community, including CIA Director Bill Burns, strongly advised against suggesting the possibility of U.S. troops, fearing it would accelerate Putin's plans. Burns believed that such a statement would not only hasten the invasion, but also complicate the formation of an international coalition to support Ukraine. This disagreement over the role of ambiguity and the potential for bluffing represents a significant strategic divide between the president and his advisors. Bob Woodward also details the efforts to deter Putin through diplomacy and intelligence sharing. Biden engaged in heated phone calls with Putin, warning of severe consequences for invasion, while also attempting to address Russia's security concerns. Secretary of State Blinken met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Geneva, seeking to understand the core motivations behind Russia's actions and offering to discuss issues like missile placement and military exercises. However, these diplomatic efforts were complicated by U.S. intelligence, revealing that Russia was planning false flag operations to create a pretext for invasion. The U.S. attempted to preempt these operations by publicly disclosing the intelligence, a move aimed at undermining Putin's justifications for war. Furthermore, Bob Woodward sheds light on the internal assessments within the U.S. government regarding the situation in Ukraine. Biden expressed frustration with the Obama administration's response to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, viewing it as a license to continue. This perspective informed his determination to take a firmer stance against further Russian aggression. The story also recounts a conversation between former President Trump and his advisor, General Kellogg, where they discussed Putin's potential motivations and the perceived weakness of the Biden administration following the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Bob Woodward recounts CIA Director Burns's secret mission to Kyiv to warn President Zelensky about the impending invasion, emphasizing the specific details of the Russian plan, including the attempt to seize Hostomel Airport and assassinate Zelensky. Despite the urgency of the warning, Zelensky remained skeptical of a full-scale invasion, partly due to assurances from European leaders and concerns about provoking Russia through full military mobilization. The author also describes the concern that if Ukraine fell quickly, top-of-the-line American military technology would fall into Russian hands. Finally, Bob Woodward also mentions an unscripted statement by Biden where he seemed to suggest that a minor incursion by Russia might elicit a different response, causing confusion among allies and raising questions about the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Sullivan worked to reassure NATO allies that U.S. policy had not changed, and Biden subsequently clarified that any Russian military movement across the border would be considered an invasion. The remaining question was, had this statement of no U.S. troops encouraged or even given Putin a green light, believing that he would not directly or in any way face the largest and most experienced military force in the world? Section 6. This section covers chapters 25 to 29 in the book. Along Ukraine's borders, Russian field hospitals were visibly constructed, blood banks were transported, and mobile morgues arrived for the expected casualties, according to Bob Woodward's sources. U.S. intelligence agencies warned the White House that Putin's invasion order could come within weeks, days, or hours. Mindful of the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, Sullivan addressed the public on February 11, urging all American citizens in Ukraine to depart immediately, emphasizing the president would not risk military lives for those who chose to stay. Sullivan stated firmly, "We are not going to war in Ukraine," reassuring that American forces would not engage in conflict with Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron frequently called Putin, believing he could reason with the Russian leader. Macron reported to Biden that Putin had given his word he would not invade. Biden, however, suspected Putin had already decided to invade, a sentiment echoed by General Mark Milley and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who dismissed Russia's claims of a mere military exercise, given the prolonged troop buildup since September 2021. Austin confronted Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu directly, stating, "I know exactly what you're doing with your troop buildup along the border." Shoigu maintained it was just an exercise, but Austin pressed for its end date, warning, "We know exactly what you're doing. Don't do it." Austin traveled to Vilnius, Lithuania, to reassure Baltic allies, who feared they might be next if Ukraine fell. The nervousness was palpable, fueled by former President Trump's Article 5 saber rattling, which had sown doubts about U.S. commitment to NATO. Austin assured Estonia's Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur, "When the time comes, we'll have your back," promising swift U.S. military intervention. He later told his advisors that calm was essential, warning that Putin's actions could trigger the largest land war in Europe since World War II. As a final diplomatic effort, Vice President Kamala Harris attended the Munich Security Conference, tasked with convincing Zelensky of the imminent invasion and demonstrating unified U.S. and NATO support for Ukraine's sovereignty. Harris called out Russia for spreading disinformation and warned of consequences for those complicit in the invasion, sharply contrasting the Biden-Harris approach with the Trump administration's isolationism. In a private meeting, Harris confronted Zelensky about the likelihood of an imminent Russian invasion, presenting intelligence data indicating 200,000 Russian troops, including 40,000 in Belarus. Zelensky downplayed the threat, leading to a tense exchange. Harris urged him to consider succession and escape plans, emphasizing the gravity of the situation, but wondered if the U.S. had done enough. On February 21, Putin publicly set Russia on the path to war, aggressively polling his top officials on recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. The televised meeting showed Putin's dominance, particularly in his interaction with Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service Sergei Naryshkin, whom he corrected and humiliated. Biden immediately issued an executive order blocking economic activity in Donetsk and Luhansk, and Germany halted the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project. Trump praised Putin's move as genius, admiring his ability to take over a large section of Ukraine and act as a peacekeeper, a move Trump suggested could be emulated on the U.S. southern border. On February 23, CIA Director Bill Burns interrupted Sullivan's Ukraine meeting to announce, "It's happening," signaling Putin had ordered the invasion. The next day, Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine, threatening severe consequences for anyone who interfered. Explosions rocked Kyiv and Kharkiv as Russian troops crossed the border. Zelensky, amid the chaos, learned the invasion was occurring from all directions. The head of Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, initially skeptical, had to be evacuated from Kyiv as the invasion began. In Washington, Biden authorized the movement of U.S. forces in Europe to bolster NATO's eastern flank. Trump, at a fundraiser, assessed the invasion as a real estate deal, noting Putin had taken over a country for minimal sanctions. Zelensky called for international support, urging Biden to ask world leaders to support Ukraine, with Biden offering assistance for Zelensky to set up a temporary government in exile, which Zelensky declined. Zelensky rallied his nation, distributing weapons to civilians and famously responding to a Russian warship demanding surrender at Snake Island with Russian warship, "Go F yourself," a statement that became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Despite rumors of fleeing, Zelensky posted a video showing himself and his team in Kyiv, vowing to defend their independence. Early in the war, Russian forces attempted to capture Hostomel Airport, a strategic cargo airfield near Kyiv, but Ukrainian forces fiercely resisted, preventing Russia from using it to resupply. The Russian military made several miscalculations, including driving tanks through the highly toxic Red Forest, near Chernobyl, and failing to neutralize Ukrainian command and air defense systems. A 40-mile convoy of Russian troops stalled due to Ukrainian tactics, and a Ukrainian sniper killed a Russian major general. By February 28, the stalled convoy highlighted the Russian military's incompetence. Burns noted the Ukrainians had strategically targeted the lead and rear vehicles, as well as fuel trucks, effectively immobilizing the convoy. The battle for Kyiv lasted less than 5 weeks, and the Russians ultimately withdrew, leaving behind evidence of horrific war crimes. U.S. intelligence revealed Russia's plans to create concentration camps to filter out uncooperative civilians. Despite initial underestimations of Ukrainian resolve and overestimations of the Russian military, the National Security Council acknowledged the successful anticipation of Russia's invasion plans. Figures like Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson downplayed the conflict, with Bannon calling Ukraine a concept, and Carlson questioning why Americans should hate Putin. Biden, however, viewed Putin's actions as evil and a threat to freedom-loving nations worldwide. To counter Putin's goals, Biden considered expanding NATO, particularly with Finland and Sweden, which had historically maintained military non-alignment. The invasion of Ukraine shifted public opinion in these countries, with significant increases in support for NATO membership. Biden met with Finnish President Sauli Niinistö to discuss Finland's path to NATO. Niinistö expressed concerns about the vulnerability during the interim period before gaining Article 5 protection. Biden tasked Sullivan and Feiner with finding ways to mitigate this risk. Despite warnings from Russia, Finland and Sweden moved forward with their NATO applications, receiving security guarantees from the US, the UK, and other NATO nations. On May 12, Finland announced its official intention to join NATO, and Niinistö informed Putin directly, who claimed it was a mistake. Shortly after, Sweden followed suit, breaking its long-standing policy of military non-alignment. NATO launched large-scale military exercises in the Baltic region, sending a clear message to Putin. Finland formally joined NATO on April 4, 2023, doubling Russia's border with NATO. Sweden also became a full member on March 7, 2024, marking a significant shift in European security dynamics. Section 7. This section covers chapters 30 to 34 in the book. In this story, Bob Woodward explores several critical angles of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. One key aspect is the internal discussions and external pressures faced by Western leaders, particularly regarding military aid and strategic involvement. For instance, Senator Lindsey Graham's conversations with Trump revealed differing opinions on how aggressively to counter Putin, including a controversial suggestion of assassination. Trump, on the other hand, mused about a convoluted plan to blame China for bombing Russia, illustrating the spectrum of ideas, some dangerous, some absurd, circulating among political figures. The story also highlights the shifting goals of the U.S. in the conflict. Initially focused on helping Ukraine defend itself, the objective evolved to weakening Russia's ability to threaten Europe. This shift is underscored by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's statements about diminishing Russia's military capabilities, signaling a more assertive stance. Furthermore, the narrative delves into the complexities of NATO's involvement and the philosophical changes it underwent. Despite Ukraine not being a NATO member, the alliance committed to providing substantial military support, training, and intelligence, effectively integrating Ukraine into its defense framework. This transformation ironically fulfilled Putin's fears of an increasingly capable, NATO-aligned Ukraine. Another significant point is the internal struggle within the German government regarding the provision of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's apprehension about Germany being perceived as an aggressive military power again reflects the heavy weight of history. This concern led to intense discussions with U.S. officials, culminating in a deal where the U.S. committed to providing Abrams tanks to give Germany political cover to supply their Leopard tanks. This episode underscores the delicate balance between providing necessary aid to Ukraine and managing historical and political sensitivities. Lastly, the story touches on domestic political issues in the U.S., such as Trump's continued focus on the 2020 election and criticisms of aid packages to Ukraine. These elements illustrate the divisions within the Republican Party and the broader challenges of maintaining a unified front on foreign policy issues. Section 8. This section covers chapters 35 to 39 in the book. In late September 2022, Jake Sullivan, sitting at his desk in the West Wing of the White House, reviewed top-secret intelligence indicating that Vladimir Putin was considering using a tactical nuclear weapon in the Russia-Ukraine war. U.S. intelligence agencies reported Putin was growing desperate due to battlefield failures. Ukrainian forces, backed by U.S. and European weaponry, had launched a successful counteroffensive, reclaiming territory near Kharkiv. U.S. intelligence considered this a humiliating defeat for Putin. If Russian troops were encircled in Kherson, there was a 50% chance Putin would order the use of tactical nuclear weapons to avoid a catastrophic loss. CIA Director Burns reported that some of Putin's generals were advising him to withdraw. If Kherson fell, Putin's control over Crimea would be threatened, which Burns believed was an existential issue for Putin. Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 troops and the annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces, including Kherson, declaring them part of Russia. He warned that Russia would use all available means to protect its territory. Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence, was deeply concerned about Putin's willingness to use nuclear weapons. Biden instructed Sullivan to communicate the U.S. response to the Russians and sent CIA Director Bill Burns to meet with Russian counterparts to avert a cataclysm. The president also communicated directly with Putin, emphasizing the catastrophic consequences of using a nuclear weapon. On October 6, Biden warned of the prospect of Armageddon, unseen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin prepared to speak with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Austin believed Putin's new strategy was to outlast the West's support for Ukraine. On October 21, Austin told Shoigu that any use of nuclear weapons would be a world-changing event with dire consequences, potentially isolating Russia. General Mark Milley also spoke with his Russian counterpart, General Valery Gerasimov, to understand the conditions under which Russia would use nuclear weapons. Gerasimov cited potential attacks threatening the regime, weapons of mass destruction, or catastrophic battlefield losses. At the White House, Sullivan and John Feiner were concerned about the 50% chance of nuclear use. Sullivan assembled a Tiger team to prepare for low-probability, high-impact events, including nuclear weapon use. Austin and Milley mapped out possible nuclear scenarios and military response options. Biden made it clear the U.S. would not respond with nuclear weapons to battlefield use in Ukraine, though they remained a possibility. There was no good option, but the World War II escalation path would be extremely dangerous. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner emphasized that the detonation of a single tactical nuclear weapon would destroy the post-World War II world order. In Munich, Germany, Secretary of State Blinken reported European interest in providing Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. President Biden initially withheld approval, fearing escalation, but later agreed to start training Ukrainian pilots on the aircraft. Bob Woodward attended a reception on March 6, 2023. General Milley told Woodward that Donald Trump was a danger to the country. No one has ever been as dangerous to this country as Donald Trump. Sullivan and Da Silva had to deal with was the sustainability of Ukraine's 155 ammunition, because Ukraine was churning through 155 ammunition at an alarming pace and at risk of running out. Sullivan instructed Colonel Da Silva looking for countries that were under the radar, those that might not want to donate to Ukraine, but who might be willing to sell to the U.S. instead, for the U.S. to deliver to Ukraine. What did South Korea have? South Africa, Egypt, Cyprus, Ecuador. Section 9. This section covers chapters 40 to 44 in the book. On June 11, 2023, Colonel Joe Da Silva told Sullivan about Ukraine's dwindling ammunition. Da Silva mentioned they were using about double the artillery they projected. Ukraine was using about upwards of 10,000 rounds of 155 ammunition per day. Da Silva warned that Ukraine could run out of ammo by the end of July, which meant if there was an artillery war, the end was near for Ukraine. Da Silva said his current role in helping Ukraine was the purest cause he had ever been a part of in his 21 years in the U.S. Army. The Pentagon confirmed that the only significant supply of 155s on Earth that could fire from the howitzers were the U.S. cluster munitions. The U.S. had a large stockpile of 413,000 DPICMs with a safer 1.3% dud rate, and a little over 800,000 clusters with a 2.35% dud rate. Opposition to clusters was framed in terms of human rights, but it was difficult for Sullivan and Feiner to think of a more brazen violation than if the Russians were allowed to march forward to conduct further atrocities in Ukrainian-occupied territories. More than 2,400 Ukrainian civilians were killed in Mariupol. Putin was also responsible for the mass abduction of at least 6,000 Ukrainian children. The assessment was that if the clusters were not given, the Russian army would have a 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 advantage in the artillery rounds at their disposal, so Biden agreed to the transfer. Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's personal chef turned private military contractor, challenged the Kremlin's motives for fighting in Ukraine publicly. In the months-long battle for Bakhmut, Prigozhin reported that Wagner had lost more than 20,000 men. Fed up on Friday, June 23, 2023, Prigozhin turned his forces around in Ukraine and ordered them to march for justice to Moscow. 2 months later, Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash north of Moscow. During an economic conference in Russia in September, Putin said, "Mr. Trump says he will resolve all burning issues within several days, including the Ukrainian crisis. We cannot help but feel happy about it. Asked about Putin's comments, Trump gloated. I like that he said that because that means what I'm saying is right. On Saturday, October 7, 2023, Ron Dermer was notified of a barrage of 3,000 rockets launched at Israel. Hamas had started a massive surprise attack. By the time Dermer arrived at the Kuria, Hamas militants had begun to massacre any Israeli they could find. This is war, Netanyahu told Dermer. Israel's national security advisor Tzachai Hangbai said, "What is happening is an attack against Israel, a coordinated attack." Middle East NSC coordinator Brett McGurk wrote back at 1:12 a.m., "We are with you." Hamas militants stormed across the border into southern Israel and started slaughtering entire families, including children and babies. Hamas shot, beheaded, immolated, dismembered, and burned Israelis alive. President Biden convened a call with his national security team. Biden said he wanted to speak to Netanyahu as soon as possible and said, "There needs to be the strongest condemnation of what has happened, and of Hamas." On the phone later that day, Netanyahu said to Biden, "Israel will win a war against Hamas," and also told him to message Hezbollah to stay out. Jake Sullivan said that Netanyahu sounded like he believed he might really lose his country, and told him that Israel's vaunted military and sophisticated intelligence had just been shattered. It took 3 days for the Israelis to get a handle on the attack. Overall, Hamas killed more than 1,200 Israelis and dragged more than 240 hostages back across the border into underground tunnels in Gaza. On October 6, the day before the attack, Israel's intelligence assessment was that Hamas in Gaza was deterred, and that Hamas was not strong enough to take on Israel. Months later, Israel's intelligence assessments showed that on October 6, only 3 Hamas leaders knew the plan for the attack on Israel the next day. Hamas concealed it from Israeli intelligence by keeping it within the smallest circle. In another extraordinary oversight, Israel's intelligence agencies later discovered that they had been in possession of Hamas's attack plan almost a full year ahead of the October 7 attack. Israel had failed to act on the information, and as a consequence, did not have enough of their forces close to the border when the invasion began. The day after October 7, Jake Sullivan was looking for deterrence measures or symbols of deterrence in order to cool down the region, and decided the best option was the American aircraft carrier. Sullivan called Kelly Magsamen and asked, "Don't we have a carrier strike group in the Med for Ukraine purposes?" Austin agreed and directed the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group to move to the eastern Mediterranean. Closer to Israel, Secretary of State Tony Blinken called the head of Qatar's government, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. Blinken told MBAR urgently, "There are American hostages and there are Americans who are hostage. It's a game changer for us." Jake Sullivan knew Emir Al Thani and Prime Minister MBAR were key to getting the hostages out safely, because the Emir had hosted Hamas political leadership in the capital, Doha, for years and contributed aid in the form of hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza. Section 10. This section covers chapters 45 to 49 in the book. In this story, Bob Woodward sheds light on the intense diplomatic efforts and internal deliberations surrounding the conflicts involving Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and Hamas. Regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the article notes President Biden's commitment to equipping Ukraine with billions of dollars in U.S. weapons to defend against Russia's invasion. However, Biden insisted that no U.S. troops would be involved in the fighting, highlighting the administration's strategy of supporting Ukraine without direct military intervention. The bulk of the article focuses on the Israel-Hamas conflict, particularly the immediate aftermath of the October 7 attack by Hamas. Woodward recounts a tense phone call between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, where Netanyahu sought assurance of full U.S. support for a preemptive strike against Hezbollah. Biden, however, cautioned against such action, warning of a broader regional war and potential risks to the Israeli population. This exchange underscores the delicate balance the U.S. sought to maintain, supporting Israel's security while preventing escalation. The article details the U.S. intelligence assessment that contradicted Israel's claim of an imminent Hezbollah attack. Biden's advisors unanimously stated that there was no intel to support the preemptive strike Israel was about to do. Biden directly advised Netanyahu to avoid being pushed into war by his military and to allow time for a more considered judgment. Woodward emphasizes the depth of distrust between Biden and Netanyahu, which threatened to strain the alliance during a critical period. Woodward describes the frantic efforts to de-escalate the situation, including Sullivan's forceful communication with Dermer and McGurk's outreach to CENTCOM Commander Eric Kurilla. The article portrays a chaotic situation where Israel was on the brink of launching a major attack based on erroneous information. It highlights the critical role of U.S. intervention in averting a wider conflict. The narrative also explores the challenges of navigating the complex dynamics of the Middle East. Blinken's efforts to engage with regional leaders, from King Abdullah of Jordan to the Emir of Qatar, reveal the diverse perspectives and concerns surrounding the conflict. These interactions highlight the need for a nuanced approach that considers the interests and sensitivities of various actors in the region. The article also underscores the tensions between the U.S. and Israel regarding humanitarian assistance to Gaza. Netanyahu initially resisted allowing aid into Gaza, citing the anger and distrust that was a result of the Hamas attack. However, Blinken pressed Netanyahu by reminding him of the U.S. strategic and moral position to help the Palestinians, and that the pressure from the other leaders in the region would close in on them. After several hours of back and forth, and threatening to pull the president's support to the region, Netanyahu agreed in principle to opening aid to Gaza. Biden's trip to Israel became a strategic decision to align with the country, but he warned against being consumed with rage, reminding them of the errors the U.S. made after 9/11. Lastly, the article shows Secretary Austin's relationship with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant to hold Israel accountable for civilian casualties, and to get straight answers on what happened to specific issues that were raised by the U.S. and other leaders. Section 11. This section covers chapters 50 to 54 in the book. In this story, Bob Woodward focuses on the intricate dynamics of the Israel-Hamas conflict and, to a lesser extent, the tensions surrounding Russia. Regarding Israel and Hamas, the narrative emphasizes the United States' delicate balancing act. Vice President Harris urges Israel to protect innocent civilians, highlighting the devastating scale of suffering in Gaza. The U.S. attempts to mediate a hostage deal, demonstrating the challenges in negotiating with Hamas and the internal Israeli political performance by Netanyahu. Arab leaders express the need for a political plan that incorporates Palestinian leadership in Gaza and a path toward a Palestinian state, reflecting the widespread sentiment that military solutions alone are insufficient. The story further details Secretary of State Blinken's diplomatic efforts. Arab countries are hesitant to engage in post-conflict discussions without a clear plan for Palestinian statehood, illustrating the deep-seated complexities and preconditions for regional cooperation. Blinken proposes supporting an Arab-led force in Gaza, while discussions with Israel's war cabinet reveal stark differences in opinion. Israeli officials, like Dermer, adamantly oppose rewarding terrorism with a Palestinian state, showing the deep-seated opposition to a two-state solution within the Israeli government. McGurk's negotiations with Qatar result in the release of hostages, highlighting the fragile and complex nature of these agreements. The story further explains the nuances of domestic politics within Israel and the U.S. Regarding Russia, the story briefly touches on the death of Alexei Navalny. President Biden holds Putin responsible, underscoring the ongoing tensions and human rights concerns related to the Russian regime. Overall, Woodward paints a picture of complex international relations, where the U.S. navigates the challenges of mediating conflicts, balancing alliances, and addressing humanitarian crises. Section 12. This section covers chapters 55 to 59 in the book. Retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who served as a senior advisor throughout Trump's presidency, emphasized the critical importance of securing the southern border and strengthening the military. Kellogg expressed deep concerns about the current policies of Joe Biden, particularly regarding regional conflicts in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. Kellogg consistently highlighted Trump's ability to listen and consider diverse viewpoints, especially in closed-door meetings. He recounted a National Security Council meeting where Trump sought input from every participant, even the note-taker, showcasing his inclusive approach to decision-making. Kellogg believed that Trump's direct and immediate decision-making style, exemplified by his decision to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, set him apart. Senator Lindsey Graham, while in Saudi Arabia, reached out to Trump to discuss normalization efforts between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Graham, who had previously criticized Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, now considered himself a friend and was working to facilitate a defense agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia as an incentive for recognizing Israel. Graham reminded MBS that the prospect of a serious bilateral defense cooperation agreement with the United States, ensuring U.S. defense of Saudi Arabia if attacked, was a significant advantage. However, MBS expressed concerns about domestic anger over the situation in Gaza and insisted on progress towards a Palestinian state as a condition for normalizing relations with Israel, something Graham recognized as challenging. The Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Herzog, informed Brett McGurk of a strike in Damascus, Syria, that killed IRGC commander Mohammad Reza Zahedi, raising concerns about potential Iranian retaliation. The U.S. quickly distanced itself from the strike, emphasizing that they had no prior knowledge or involvement. McGurk feared that Hezbollah might exploit the situation to launch a large-scale attack on Israel, escalating the conflict. President Biden reassured Netanyahu of U.S. support for Israel's defense against Iran, but cautioned against attacking Iran directly. Biden urged Netanyahu to adopt a clear strategy in Gaza and criticized the lack of progress in humanitarian efforts. Biden also pushed Netanyahu to accept a hostage exchange deal, offering significant concessions to Hamas in return for the release of hostages. CIA Director Bill Burns visited Ukraine and found that President Zelensky was increasingly worried about the shortages of air defense and artillery munitions. He reported that the loss of Avdiivka underscored the urgent need for continued U.S. support. Burns emphasized that if Russia wins the war, it would have significant global implications, particularly for China's ambitions. He argued that supporting Ukraine was crucial to deterring Xi Jinping's expansionist goals and maintaining stability in the region. Section 13. This section covers chapters 60 to 64 in the book. President Biden confronted a war much closer to home at the United States-Mexico border, with over 2 million migrants apprehended each year in 2022 and 2023. Homeland Security Secretary Ali Mayorkas privately described Republican attacks on his leadership as demonic. Biden aimed for a gentler immigration approach, but this ignited a political firestorm as Republicans blamed him for a Welcome to America sign, leading to the word invasion appearing in Republican television ads. Biden, in turn, blamed Republicans for lacking funding to improve border controls, and later Trump for killing a bipartisan border deal. Bob Woodward's discussion with President Andrzej Duda of Poland revealed concerns about Russia's potential victory in Ukraine. Duda emphasized the importance of Ukraine remaining a sovereign state for Poland's security. Poland, sharing borders with both Ukraine and Russian-controlled regions, remembered being abandoned during World War II and highly valued NATO's support. Duda called for NATO countries to increase defense spending. He expressed that Russia could not win the war in Ukraine and stated the need to support Ukraine with military technology, something that was not happening as the U.S. Congress was stalling a $60.8 billion aid package. Trump, while out of office, still held considerable sway over the Republican Party, influencing decisions related to the aid package. Eventually, the U.S. House of Representatives approved the aid to Ukraine. Regarding the conflict between Israel and Hamas, Biden cautioned Netanyahu against a large-scale military operation in Rafah. He stressed the importance of maintaining alliances with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which could be jeopardized by an operation in Rafah. CIA Director Bill Burns and Brett McGurk worked to confirm the well-being of American hostages held by Hamas, with Hamas releasing a video of hostage Hirsch Goldberg-Polin. President Biden met with Abigail Eden, a young girl who was held hostage by Hamas for 50 days after her parents were killed in front of her. DNI Avril Haines reported that Putin had been weakened as a result of the war, but this did not make him less dangerous. The war had cost Russia's economy and military significantly. Haines cautioned against pushing a nuclear power like Russia too far, which raised the risk of escalation. Putin's own words revealed his mindset, where he prioritized victory. Amidst these global tensions, Trump faced a hush money trial in New York, with 34 counts of falsifying business records. Trump believed a conviction could benefit him politically. His former lawyer, Tim Parlater, thought Trump's campaign was influencing decision-making in the courtroom and said that he was surrounded by the wrong people. Parlater also stated the trial was a result of poor decisions regarding lawyer selection and stated how to avoid the legal trouble. Trump was convicted on all 34 counts, which led to him becoming the first former U.S. president to be a convicted felon, with his campaign raising over $50 million following the verdict. Section 14. This section covers chapters 65 to 69 in the book. In December 2023, Hunter Biden expressed his concerns about Republican efforts targeting him, fearing they aimed to undermine his father's presidency and cause personal harm. One of President Biden's closest associates noted that these attacks deeply affected the president, who frequently checked on his son. Hunter Biden faced high-profile criminal trials in 2024, adding to the family's distress. Despite these challenges, the bond between President Biden and his son remained strong. A close friend of the family said that the president's biggest worry was Hunter's mental and physical health, and not the political fallout. Hunter Biden's struggle to escape his past was evident, with a friend noting his sense of being trapped. President Biden privately criticized Attorney General Merrick Garland for appointing a special counsel to investigate Hunter, a decision his inner circle had supported. Despite publicly pledging to stay out of the Justice Department's investigation, President Biden occasionally checked in with Hunter's lawyer, Ab Lowell, to offer his support. Tensions arose between the White House lawyers and Hunter's legal team, with the former preferring Hunter to maintain a low profile. Hunter focused on overcoming his addictions and seeking a normal life. In his memoir, Hunter recounted his experiences with crack cocaine addiction. President Biden acknowledged his guilt over the Republican attacks on Hunter, feeling they were a consequence of his presidency. Hunter was convicted on federal felony gun charges in June 2024. President Biden stated he would accept the outcome and respect the judicial process, while affirming his unwavering support for his son. Secrets and hidden feelings often play significant roles in human relationships, and President Biden's frustrations with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had been building up, finally erupting in the spring of 2024. Biden privately expressed his deep distrust and bitterness towards Netanyahu, accusing him of prioritizing himself over the well-being of the region. President Biden voiced concerns about Netanyahu's approach in Gaza, where intense bombing campaigns had devastated the densely populated area, with a significant portion of the population being children. Despite Biden's warnings and threats to withhold weapons, Netanyahu continued his military strategies. Before October 7, Netanyahu's political leadership was shaky, facing criminal charges and criticism for weakening Israel's judiciary. The Hamas attack, however, allowed him to regain his position as a strong wartime leader, shielding him from political downfall. Biden believed Netanyahu was focused on self-preservation and avoiding jail. The president also complained about Netanyahu's lack of a post-war plan for Gaza, a concern echoed in reports from Secretary of State Blinken's meetings. DNI Avril Haines suggested Netanyahu was motivated by saving his legacy and avoiding being remembered for the October 7 failures. Despite Biden's pressure, Netanyahu proceeded with a ground invasion into Gaza, leading to a humanitarian crisis. Blinken was emotionally and physically drained by Netanyahu's actions. Biden warned against a military offensive in Rafah, but Netanyahu eventually sent in troops, prompting Biden to label him a liar. Despite his frustrations, Biden did not want to jeopardize Israel's security, especially with threats from Iran and Hezbollah. Netanyahu's military assault expanded, leading to civilian deaths in tent camps near Rafah, which he called a tragic accident. Benny Gantz, a key official in the war cabinet, resigned, highlighting Netanyahu's focus to right-wing members of his coalition. Sullivan described the October 7 Hamas attack as a colossal intelligence failure by Israel. In June 2024, Israel rescued hostages in Gaza, but hundreds of Palestinians were killed in the rescue operation. Biden's attempts to prevent a humanitarian crisis in Gaza were unsuccessful, and he continued to provide military aid to Netanyahu, walking a delicate line with Israel. In the lead-up to the 2024 election, political violence was a major concern, with Senator Lindsey Graham suggesting a terrorist attack could significantly impact Biden's chances. Trump used the border crisis as a centerpiece of his fear campaign. Graham observed Trump becoming more erratic due to the court cases. Trump's language grew more aggressive, with pledges of payback against those investigating him. The election was shaping up to be perilous and unpredictable. Graham said that Biden had lost control of his fate, and a single event could change the election. Section 15. This section covers chapters 70 to 77 in the book. On June 27, just over 4 months from Election Day, President Biden appeared pale, tired, and weak during the presidential debate, triggering a crisis for his political survival. Bob Woodward writes that Biden struggled to form clear sentences, and his voice was barely audible, leading to panic among Democrats. As a result, there was a visible collapse of public trust in Biden's ability to lead, and Democratic leaders began to call on him to step aside. Despite initially dismissing the debate as a bad night, Biden's advisors knew that any further missteps could sink his campaign. Blinken advised Biden to consider his legacy, questioning whether he truly wanted another 4 years in office. He acknowledged the emotional toll of Hunter's struggles on Biden and emphasized the difficulty of reversing the negative campaign narrative surrounding his capacity. The focus needed to shift back to Trump or a strong affirmative agenda. Blinken noted Biden's main concern was beating Trump and questioned whether other candidates like Kamala Harris had a better chance. On July 13, an attempted assassination shook the race when a gunman opened fire at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, injuring Trump and killing one spectator. The assassination attempt had shaken Trump. Despite this, Trump was soon back on the campaign trail, delivering a speech at the Republican convention with a mix of unifying messages and cage fighter rhetoric, declaring the election as the most important in history. Then, on July 21, Biden announced his withdrawal from the race, endorsing Kamala Harris as his replacement. Bob Woodward writes that Biden showed he could accept the hard truths and see what was in the public interest, showing it was too much for him to handle. CIA Director Bill Burns reported that ISIS-K was planning attacks inside the United States, showing that the threat stream is really troubling. U.S. intelligence agencies were also concerned about threats from the Sahel region of West Africa, and Burns worried about the danger of radicalized individuals. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed concern about the convergence of artificial intelligence and advanced weaponry. Burns also warned about Russia's potential deployment of a nuclear payload in space, describing the danger as unplanned, inadvertent escalation. He believed it was an extremely dangerous time for the United States and global stability, describing the warning systems as blinking red. Jason Miller, Trump's top aide, outlined the campaign's strategy to define Harris as incompetent and radically liberal, contrasting her with Trump. He criticized her past roles and questioned her readiness for prime time. Trump himself attacked Harris, calling her a radical left lunatic and questioning her identity as black. Harris dismissed Trump's words as divisive and disrespectful. Regarding international relations, Netanyahu met with Harris, who reiterated her support for Israel but expressed concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the growing anti-Israel sentiment. The Israelis felt that the tone was more observational and less critical. Bob Woodward explains that Harris and Netanyahu also discussed the settlements, but Netanyahu dismissed the accusations and focused on attacks on Jews in the West Bank. Biden emphasized the importance of giving Palestinians a political horizon and working on governance and security. Following the meeting, Harris publicly criticized Israel's treatment of civilians in Gaza, which angered Netanyahu. On the topic of the Russia-Ukraine war, an aide revealed multiple phone calls between Trump and Putin, though Trump's aide, Miller, denied being aware of any such calls. Miller claimed Trump could stop the war with a phone call to Putin and Zelensky, saying that the war isn't going to be solved until President Trump wins on November 5th, and it's clear that he's coming in. He was also not aware of any contact. DNI Avril Haines carefully avoided confirming or denying the contacts between Trump and Putin. Trump boasted about his affinity for strongmen like Putin and Kim Jong-un, relationships that Dan Coates found troubling and mysterious. In late July, regional tensions in the Middle East spiked again. Israel's actions, including taking out Hezbollah's top military commander and assassinating Hamas senior leader Ismail Haniyeh, drew strong criticism. Biden yelled on the phone at Netanyahu. These attacks risked escalating the conflict. Israel defended its actions by highlighting the threats they face from various fronts, including Hamas, Iran, and its proxies. U.S. officials worked to manage potential retaliation against Israel, with Sullivan emphasizing that the only way out of the situation was a ceasefire. Bob Woodward reflects on the importance of war decisions in defining national leaders. He emphasizes Biden's commitment to keeping U.S. ground troops out of war, citing his decisions regarding Ukraine and Israel as examples. Sullivan argues that Biden's approach has kept the homeland safe and allowed the U.S. to support Ukraine without direct military involvement. Austin highlights Biden's focus on finding effective solutions without necessarily putting troops in combat, praising his skill and courage in achieving positive outcomes.
Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.